Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for joining me. I have a series that I had started writing uh, maybe a year ago called "The Basis for Our Confusion," and it's basically a book. Um, I'm never gonna, I'll never publish anything, or I'll never have the means to do anything like that. So, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna release it in audio form. I'll go ahead and start doing that today. Um, because of the issues that I have with internet and things, there's no way I'll be able to put this out all in one uh, segment because just yesterday it took me 7 hours to upload a 20-minute video. So, a couple hour long one, that's not, I mean, I guess it would take me days sitting around somewhere to upload that. So we'll do 2 or 3 chapters at a time. And let's begin now. This is the audiobook, the first 3 chapters of The Basis for Our Confusion. Chapter 1. What is information? There can be no doubt that we're living in one of the most confusing times in history. We're just smart enough to think we know what we're doing, yet still dumb enough to think we know what we're doing. We feel empowered and informed when we read the newest, shiniest piece of propaganda that's so aesthetically pleasing to our eyes, hearts, and minds, all perfectly packaged up and sent to our go-to news feeds on our device for our consumption. And as will be the case for millions of these people, they will drink it all up without question. Even if the particular news bit seems a bit illogical or even in some cases immoral. A brief, pretty current example of an illogical fallacy found within your daily news indoctrination is the coverage of the southern border crisis. We have a humanitarian disaster where we see millions of immigrants coming across the border ever since the new administration took over and relaxed more strict border policies and halted production of the border wall. This is a simple fix, as one could clearly see that going back to the previous policies would work, as they were doing just that up until January of 2021, and the completion of the border wall would be an added bonus and a great future deterrent, thus preventing this from ever occurring again sometime in the future. The problem is that going back to those policies and a wall, we are told, is racist. Now, this book series is not intended to debate this clearly logical fallacy. In fact, we'll let the powers that be tell us that this is racist. They can have that point for the sake of this argument. The problem is that when we now start to take a look at what's going on in Europe, in Ukraine, and with Russia, we get some interesting messaging. We're told that we must be there to help Ukraine protect itself, to protect Ukraine's sovereignty. And this doesn't seem to gel well. This doesn't reconcile with most people. This is illogical thinking. Yet these people won't care. They will find whatever reason they can to back up and confirm what it is their shiny news feed has told them. A brief example of an immoral fallacy found within our news feeds is the way that these news publications tell us that CRT and CRT type of curriculum in schools is good. Teaching children as young as 6 that they have been, and still are, being separated by their skin color, being labeled by their skin color, and that their future is determined by their skin color. Or maybe a news article justifying how parents allowed a 6-year-old to choose their gender and how tolerant and trendy and progressive those parents are for allowing that child to choose. It just doesn't jive with most people. I'm sorry. But it doesn't matter. They lap it up and accept it all without question for some reason. And this series of articles will dig down to the heart of this matter and attempt to determine how this is being done and by whom or by what. To address the first question as to how this is being done, we must first attempt to understand information itself and the dissemination thereof. What is information? Oxford Dictionary has some definitions. The first one says 1. Facts provided or learned about something or someone. This definition is quite straightforward and spot on in my opinion. For me, this defines my view of that word to a T. You see, the definition clearly defines information as facts. In fact, it's the very first word of that definition. The problem is Oxford's second definition of the word information, and that is, what is conveyed or represented by a particular arrangement or sequence of things. Dear listeners, I'd like you to reread that second definition and let it sink in a little bit. Oxford is saying that information can also be something that is conveyed to another or represented to another person through an arrangement or tailoring, or one could say coordinated for, in order to represent a sequence of things. Or one could say to represent a certain set of data points, for instance. Now I would like to draw your attention to something, and this is going to let you all know where this series of articles is heading. During the middle of World War II, the U.S. decided to join the other major developed nations of the world in creating their own intelligence agency, like the British MI6. It would become known as the Central Intelligence Agency, but it was first known as the Office of Strategic Services. And the first position created in that agency was a job known as the, quote, coordinator of information. This is the first position created. This shows one of the true intentions of this government agency. It's there to present to you information that may or may not be factual, but to give it to you in a way that supports a specific agenda, whatever agenda that this agency chooses to push. As you can see, Oxford's second definition of what information is the exact definition, exact job description of the very first job position created within America's first spy agency. And maybe it's just me, but this should raise everyone's eyebrows. I like the first definition better. Straightforward, to the point, with facts, not some shady sleight-of-hand representation of information tailored, tuned to a specific narrative. No. News should be facts, and there used to be an old saying, I think it went who, what, where, when, and how when it came to a news article, because that was all that there needed to be. So now when presented with this illogical fallacy about the U.S. southern border and the protecting of Ukraine's borders from hostile countries, as laid out earlier, we need to focus first on facts. Well, what have we been told about wanting to shut down the U.S. border? Whether it was a China virus or mass illegal immigration, we are told that this is a racist thing to do. And not only is the news telling us this, but so are the politicians. So is Hollywood, so is the sports world, and so are the big corporations. While I'm still lucky enough to have some critical thinking skills, along with some reading comprehension, I'm able to see that there are no facts being presented to me via the narrative controllers, whomever that may be, that are representing this to me. I am, however, able to also understand that they are presenting this to us as factual information. If you are for ending illegal immigration and wanting folks to come here legally, you are a racist. And in fact, if you want to close our borders to China, even during a deadly pandemic, you are racist. These are presented as facts. And by the way, the last one that they used when the U.S. closed air travel to China in 2020 tells you all you need to know as to the deadliness of that virus. But these are given to us as facts, so let's accept it as such. Wanting borders, wanting a sovereign nation is racist. Fine. Now let's head over to Eurasia. We have the U.S. president telling us that we have to go over there and help Ukraine. We have to protect their border. We have to protect their sovereignty. We have to protect their country. Those coordinators of information are making this a truth. They're making this so, making it a fact that the borders of Ukraine are sovereign. Period, and without exception. And many of the same people who believe that it's racist to even have a border are fine with having American boys and girls killed and possibly be killed while fighting for Ukraine's sovereignty. These two things can't be true. This is a paradox. How can one be told that we cannot want a secure border in their own country, but must sacrifice gas prices, inflation, and American blood for the border of Ukraine? When we dig into this narrative, it just doesn't stand up to scrutiny. But the problem is that many people are digging down into it and they don't know. Those behind all of this are presenting information to us as facts. However, this information is not factual. It's a bunch of made up stuff that is being used to get the masses to accept a situation that's unacceptable. It's to get the masses to first take an issue as if it's a majority issue and thrust it into the forefront like racism. once they set the tone and get everyone talking about it as a majority issue, then they begin to shape it and shape it some more until they eventually present it as fact, or maybe we should call it factual opinion, as it seems more appropriate. Now that we've got everyone on the same page, now that they've got everyone on the same page, that narrative is then continuously used to provide cover for what would otherwise be a highly unpopular decision that is literally antithetical to a nation state. Literally 100% self-destructive at its core in many ways, until the ends are finally achieved and we can all speculate as to what those ends may be. At a glance, it seems as though it's a problem of people not being able to decipher fact from fiction these days, but it's much deeper and much more sinister, I'm afraid. Chapter 2, The Deciders of Information. In the early days, information was a hard thing to come by. Information was disseminated usually beginning in the port towns, news brought in from lands beyond the sea by merchants and traveling players, and then that information was then relayed inland to all the other towns and villages. One can see, though, that this information is only as reliable as the source being the merchants and the traveling players. During the days of the monarchs or the time when they believed in the divine right to rule, where kings and queens are given their authority by God because God told them this, the only real information of the day that the people were given most likely came from the authorities, the king. There were no radio stations they could turn on and get any news, local or otherwise. There were no paper publications around where one could start, say, a newsletter or a magazine, for instance. They had to rely on establishment sources and the establishment sources, period. By this I mean the king, as stated, but also at the institutions of the day, like the colleges or universities or the religious establishments, all set up by the monarch at the time, I should add. And having said that, now would be a good time to talk about the Pope. This is the part of the series where things get polarizing, but the truth usually is. I suppose in order to not get too conspiratorial, let us assume at least that the Pope and the kings for the most part worked in conjunction with each other. Again, for the most part. The official story is that the kings are the ones that allowed the establishment of churches and allowed for the teaching of Christianity throughout their respective empires. Clearly, everyone can understand that someone could not just go around town to town teaching and preaching whatever form of religion they wanted to, recruiting and other followers along the way. I don't suppose much happened in the realm without the head monarch knowing it. So these rulers would decree things into factual existence for the monarch, for the overall empire. In the Pope's case, he would, for instance, declare a particular political rival as a heretic, accusing the person of a plethora of immoral, heretical misdeeds, and call for their immediate arrest and, of course, later execution. In many cases, all made up. The scribes are the documenters of the information of the day. Usually the special Vatican order known as the Jesuits would then make it all historical fact throughout their control of the schools and universities of the time. In the king's case, as with the Pope, the king would make a decree declaring someone as a criminal, or in most cases, declaring a whole group of people as criminals or animals, like many kings did to the Muslims during the Crusade periods. Then, of course, if the monarch won the assault or war on the group of peoples targeted, then the schools and universities of the day work with the establishment in making it all historical fact. And this still goes on today. But sometimes the things that a pope or a king wish to push upon their citizens is too radical, or even illogical or self-destructive. In these cases, kings would use something that they'd been using since at least the time of Charlemagne. I think around, 700-800? It's a thing called a think tank. Think tanks can be for policy purposes, military, defense, religious, or humanitarian. They're usually funded by outside groups, wealthy individuals, and in many cases funded by governments themselves. The King of England had the Royal United Service Institute, founded in 1831 in London, to push his policies. The U.S. got its first policy pusher, Guess the name, the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, founded in Washington, D.C. in 1910. And today there are hundreds that consult with the U.S. in some form or another. These think tanks seem like a good idea on the surface, a bunch of great minds, experts in a certain field, getting together to come up with solutions to things relevant to their field of expertise. There is, however, a problem. Someone could take control of these think tanks. They are funded in many cases by outside groups and wealthy individuals. If one of these very wealthy people wanted to take control or start their own think tank, they could effectively have their own lobby firm disguised as a think tank tackling legitimate issues. The RAND Corporation could be used as an excellent example. They were a think tank for the Department of Defense, for the Air Force in particular. It was founded by a bunch of military-industrial complex guys and now has many prominent members from many large defense corporations that currently sit on its board, which, in my opinion, is an egregious conflict of interest. One could make a very serious argument that the RAND Corporation is one humongous defense contractor lobby, but even with the clear conflict of interest, their research and their expert papers are allowed to create public defense policy for the U.S. So, once again, the info is as reliable as the merchant, as reliable as the ruler, or as reliable as the defense company executive sitting on the board of the think tank that he or she controls. Each and every one of these early information providers at the time had glaring conflicts of interest issues. As we head to more modern times, we see many of the early publishing companies popping up, the New York Times in 1850, followed by hundreds more. Then the weekly and monthly magazines like Time Magazine, founded in 1923 by intelligence operative Henry Lutz, 100% OSS. He was involved in the creation of the OSS. Time Magazine is one of the first Mockingbird publications. In fact, it was created for that, for the purpose to propagandize people. As we watch it all unfold, we see that by the beginning of the 20th century, just 6 corporations controlled 90% of the media in the U.S., and with the Fox sale to Disney, we're now left with 5. Again, we can see how this centralization of the news media leaves it peculiarly vulnerable to a powerful entity or even a powerful single individual with endless resources being able to take control of it. When we move to present day, the internet age, we start to see a very unsettling consolidation, similar in ways to what we witnessed with the centralization of the media, and it may be even worse. We have maybe 5 or 6 top internet and social media companies. Included are Google, controlling the search engines, Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube controlling the news feeds and public perception, Amazon and Microsoft controlling the clouds, and AT&T and Google controlling the app stores. We can see that we are in the same situation as the news companies. We have about 5 or 6 companies that are able to control it all. Google can school your research results and in fact make a topic unfindable, as it did in 2020 when it didn't give you much for results when you searched for the Hunter Biden laptop. Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube will take your voice away and prevent others from hearing your opinion on your side, and helps push public opinion a certain way through their fake trends. If someone wanted to start their own similar company, they would be at the whims of the Microsoft, Amazon, and Apple for their cloud storage. And that's if Apple will even allow you to offer your product in the App Store in the first place, as they removed Parler in 2020 when Parler was allowing for the truthful reporting of the Hunter Biden laptop scandal. When one stops and looks at it all, we can clearly see that control of these top-tier internet companies gives these few an ability to make a person completely invisible on the internet. And so without being too redundant, as we can see, our information is only as good as the person relaying it to us. So once again, the info is as reliable as the merchant, as reliable as the ruler, as reliable as the defense company executive sitting on the board of the think tank that he or she controls, or it's at the whims of a few top tech execs. This is a very dangerous situation, and more people need to open their eyes and start watching what's going on. Chapter 3. Operation Mockingbird. If you don't believe that a powerful group of people could take control of public opinion and thus public policy through control of monarchs and popes, or through control of large think tanks or national or global institutions like the National Institute for Health or the WHO, then maybe you'll believe that control of public opinion could be controlled via a leading state-of-the-art spy agency, or a group of spy agencies even. It's hard to deny that an operation known as Mockingbird existed within the CIA, as there is way too much internal CIA paperwork to dispute such. Many books have been written on this subject by numerous highly respected investigative journalists like Deborah Davis and Alex Constantine. The story begins in 1948. In 1948, Frank Wisner was appointed director of the Office of Special Projects. Soon afterwards, it was renamed the Office of Policy Coordination, the OPC. This became the espionage and counterintelligence branch of the Central Intelligence Agency. Wisner was told to create an organization that concentrated on, among other things, propaganda and preventative direct action. I chose these two particular examples from the departmental list of focuses because these two allow for a project such as what Mockingbird was or is. Propaganda, as many of you know, is the dissemination of false information, usually by some establishment source designed to sway the target population towards a particular mindset, one that is aligned with the establishment sources and interests. Obviously, an operation like this would best be conducted via control of the news media. However, this would be illegal and immoral unless, of course, it were justified. And this reminds me of the Twitter files and what they did with the 2020 election. They set up this 2016 Russia hoax so that they can then use it in 2020 to say to Twitter and the rest of the social media and probably the news companies, hey, don't fall for this again. There's a dump and pump, or whatever they said, that a hack and dump coming. Don't let it, what happened in 16 happen again. This is their cover. They create a fake situation that then provides cover for them to do something later. Propaganda. That was the propaganda portion. Now, that brings us to the second focus. Preventative direct action. Now, this is the justification. The Office of Policy Coordination is saying that one of its focuses is to take direct action and to do so preventatively, which would seem to suggest a preemptive action. This seems to suggest to us that the CIA is justified to take preventative action or preemptive action as long as it's being done in order to combat or neutralize some inevitable attack upon the country. Now, note the year of this is 1948. Understand the world at that time. Understand that this is the initial years of the Cold War, a terrible time on Earth as the planet could be vaporized at any moment with just the push of a button. This unprecedented time called for unprecedented action. And folks, now you understand how Operation Mockingbird was able to be approved. This was the justification. Justification to implement a preemptive propaganda campaign upon the country. Russia, again, it's the same playbook. They're giving themselves cover to tell the news companies what to do because of a serious threat from a foreign country. It's the same exact playbook. And so, as I've just laid out later on that year, 1948, Wisner established Mockingbird, a program to influence the domestic American media. Wisner recruited Philip Graham from the Washington Post, CIA, to run the project within the industry. Graham himself recruited others who had worked for military intelligence during the war. Included in this group were Stuart Aslop and Joseph Aslop and James Reston, who were all recruited from within the Georgetown sect. And there's those Jesuits again, as I've spoken about a lot on this channel. According to Deborah Davis, the author of Catherine the Great from 1979, by the early 1950s, Wisner owned respected members of the New York Times, Newsweek, CBS, and other communication vehicles. This is by 1950s. One of the most important journalists under the control of Operation Mockingbird was Joseph Aslop, whose articles appeared in over 300 different newspapers by 1951. Dozens of other well-known influential journalists from all major cities across the U.S. were also part of the network. According to Nina Burleigh, the author of A Very Private Woman of 1998, said these journalists sometimes wrote articles that were commissioned by Frank Wisner. The CIA also provided them with classified information to help them with their work. After 1953, the network was overseen by Allen Dulles, director of the CIA. By this time, Operation Mockingbird had a major influence over dozens of newspapers and wire agencies across the nation. According to Constantine, who wrote Mockingbird, the subversion of the free press by the CIA, in the 1950s, some 3,000 salaried and contract CIA employees were eventually engaged in propaganda efforts. Wisner was able to restrict newspapers from reporting about certain events. For example, the CIA plots to overthrow the governments of Iran and Guatemala. In 1954, Wisner arranged for the funding of the Hollywood production of Animal Farm, the animated allegory based on the book written by George Orwell. And folks, keep this in mind because this is the first time we can start to see the CIA and Operation Mockingbird begin to seep over into the culture, into Hollywood, because we all understand how culture is usually upstream from politics, and we will cover that in another chapter in this book. But I'm throwing this next bit of info out here so that I can soften you all up a little bit before we get to the end of this series. This next bit of info is going to show how this operation itself could have been infiltrated. It looks like it could have been infiltrated by the FBI. It's like there's multiple things going on here. J. Edgar Hoover, it seems, became jealous of the CIA's growing power. He described the OPC as Wisner's gang of weirdos. And that's kind of the pot calling the kettle black, huh? And the FBI began carrying out investigations into their past. It didn't take long to discover that some of them had been active in left-wing politics in the 1930s. And folks, they're basically talking about communism. Socialism for sure, but this is what left-wing politics meant back in the 30s. Furthermore, Hoover also gave Senator McCarthy, whom was investigating communist infiltration into our government, details of an affair that Frank Wisner had with Princess Kardashian in Romania during the war. Hoover claimed that Kardashian was a Soviet agent. Joseph McCarthy also began accusing other senior members of the CIA as being security risks. McCarthy claimed that CIA was a sinkhole of communists and claimed he intended to root out 100 of them. And I'd like to point out here, too, that all of this is occurring during the fall of the nationalist Chinese government into the hands of Mao-led communists. And many of the U.S. blame this on our very own State Department, and rightfully so, the Dixie Mission. We'll talk about that in another chapter. It's clear to many that Operation Mockingbird is still in action today and on a global scale, even though it is still technically being denied by the CIA. Critical thinking, though. The CIA has denied this even in the face of internal unclassified documents that show its existence. Internal papers speaking openly about the program, not to mention the dozens of whistleblowers. Clearly this program exists, and now ask yourself, do you think that it ever stopped? Or do you think that it most likely continued to grow? Look at the world today. Review the previous chapter in this book and understand all the consolidation of the newspapers and later the social media and other internet service providers. Take a look at all the censorship with an open mind, please. I don't care if it's a message that you may not agree with, but instead understand the oppression and tyranny that the censorship represents. Understand that censorship is simply the first and last step towards actual thought control. And it's something that nobody on this planet, but especially in this country, should ever be okay with. And finally, understand that once they've successfully removed any dissenting voices of their narrative from this internet, they will have a clear path to feeding everyone a strict diet of their thought control. And this, my friends, would be devastating to this planet. Thank you.